Good afternoon. Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. I want to thank Francis and the NewSchools team for hosting a great event and for inviting this group of former state chiefs to have this conversation at this moment in time. My name is Kunjan. I worked at the Louisiana Department of Education alongside John for 10 years, and I believe that when a state education agency sets a kid-focused vision, listens to locals, clears out the noise, and leans in to help districts and principals and teachers do their work, that state agency can have a material impact on the lives of kids at scale. And that's what we are here to talk about today, because that is a belief that I held in the 2024 under a previous federal administration, and it's a belief that I still hold today. But in light of the federal government saying that it is changing its role, we need to talk about what the role of the state could and should be. So I'm excited to have this discussion with this panel. We're going to do three things. I'm going to do a little bit of context setting. 2, I'm going to ask this group of people to answer some questions. And 3, we want to take your questions too. So there will soon be a QR code somewhere above my head that you can use to submit your questions, and we'll get to those at the end of the panel. So, like I said, context setting, some questions for this panel, and your questions at the end. So, in order to talk about the role of the state and what states should do in the time of a changing federal landscape, we need to understand what has the federal government traditionally done? What has the US Department of Ed been doing? And I'll start by saying the US Department of Education is younger than I am. It launched in 1980. Which tells you a little bit about me. And it has played a limited but an impactful role in education in our country. So primarily what the Department of Ed has done is, 1, it administers congressionally appropriated dollars to states and districts that make up about 10% of district budgets in America. This is IDA Title I, and oversees the use of those dollars. That's 1. 2, it requires states to administer assessments and have accountability systems that evaluate and shine a light on schools and districts that aren't doing a great job yet. 3, it requires data sharing. It requires states to share information about students, achievement information, discipline information, special education information, and disaggregate that data by subgroup, creating transparency. 4, it administers the NAEP, and 5, it investigates systemic violations of civil rights. So that is basically the role of the Federal Department of Education. And there are times when the US Department of Ed has played a stronger, more assertive role. No Child Left Behind being one example, Race to the Top being another example. But regardless of whether this Federal Department of Ed is playing an assertive or a passive role, state leadership has always mattered, because what I just described as the function of the Department of Education is insufficient to educate all of America's children to make sure they are literate, numerate, and can live a choice-filled life. And so the conversation about states is one that has always been important and is all the more important today given the shifting federal climate. So with that, I'm going to turn it to this esteemed group of folks who all have led state agencies and all have, through their leadership, had a material impact on the lives of kids. So I'm going to start by asking each of you, when you were in the seat of the state superintendency, how did you view that role, and how did you view the role of the federal government? And we can start with John.
Great. Well, it's great to see you, and great to see these two former colleagues. And Francis, thank you for the kind invitation. It's great to be back at NewSchools. I viewed my role as the role that the Constitution of our state said it was, which is to be the guarantor of a standard education at a minimum for every child in our public and in our state, in our non-public school system. And that's an easy thing to say, but I think it does take some reckoning, because I think a lot of us who have spent time in the system kind of, typically view the state, as I did when I started my teaching career in New Jersey. That's kind of where I sent a check and they sent me a license. They made me take the praxis, and I didn't know much more about it than that. And frankly, I'm not sure that it did much more in that time. This is pre-NCLB. than that time. So I think it's worth us spending some time here unpacking, what does it really mean for a state educator or state education agency to fulfill the mandate of its constitution, which is to be the guarantor of a quality education. That's how I viewed it. The federal government, I viewed in its best as a partner to that, and at its worst as a kind of input that had to be navigated. And I think it's also worth unpacking kind of not so much is the federal role good or bad, but what is it at its best and what is it at its worst. At its best, to me, it's an organizing principle for some of the values that you said earlier. It's a bellwether or kind of a lighthouse for states to follow. And I think at its worst, it can be a clunky regulatory vehicle that can get in the way of the nuances that schools and school systems have to manage.
Yeah, and one, Francis, thank you so much at this moment for having the foresight to center states at the center of this conversation. Similar to what John shared, raise your hand if you know the name of the state commissioner that was in office when you were in 11th grade. Now, see, look at, there are two people back there. But now raise your hand if you know the name of your favorite teacher. See? And so very similarly, before I sat in the seat, I was like, what are those folks? I mean, they give licenses for certification. Certainly if you got in trouble as a teacher, you knew the state. And as a superintendent of a district, the state was the center of all things wrong, right? Like the state made me do it, the state, ... When you sit in the role, you realize it is this dynamic policy. There's so much opportunity that can exist at a well-run, high-functioning state education agency. Everything from academic standards to credentialing to all sorts of teacher professional development, pathways, trainings. In Washington, D.C., the state education agency oversees all of student transportation. We also oversee all of early childhood education. And so, depending on the nuances of the state, the heartbeat of the education that a child receives in that jurisdiction lives and may or may not meet the mandate at the state education agency. But the individuals that leave that work are often not the faces that you see day to day. I would often tell Mayor Bowser of DC, if I'm doing my job well, nobody knows my name. I'm behind the scenes creating the space for the districts to thrive, creating the space for teachers to show up every single day with what they need to educate the children that they have the privilege to serve. And that's, I think, the dynamism of what the role is. When Kunjan posed the question on the role of the federal government, similarly to what John shared, at its best, it's the thought partner. I want to change my accountability system. I want to add an attendance metric. I want to rethink high school metrics. Thought partners that could help you ideate and then go through the process of making that real. At its worst, it's the compliance entity. You collect the data because the state made me do it. You journal down the funds because the federal government made me do it. And so I do think we have an opportunity before us to live in a space of reimagining. If we have a federal Department of Education, what is the true purpose? And as we shift, and I don't know if the framing is we're shifting things to states. States have had a tremendous amount of power to do a significant amount of things in service of their children. They need to lean into that moment. And I think collectively we should define what the role of the federal government should be.
So I would challenge you all to say if you know who your current commissioner is. Because I hazard to guess that a lot of you don't know who that person is in your home state. Thank you so much for putting this panel together, and it's so great to be with all three of you on stage. I certainly agree with what's been said so far, and when I took office in January of 2021, schools were closed, and I saw my job as fulfilling what very little the North Carolina state constitution said about the Department of Public Instruction, but also I thought very clearly about what I thought needed to change in that era when everyone was saying, well, we can't go back to doing school the way we used to before the pandemic. And I would say that we have gone back to doing school the same way we did before the pandemic. However, when I put together my strategic plan, when I hired my senior leadership team, I did that thinking we're going to make some changes. And we were able to make some changes, and we were able to get done some of the things that we wanted to get done. But I really saw my role as being an advocate to the governor's office and to the legislature, who in North Carolina has all of the authority and hold the purse strings. I saw my role as being an expert on education. I wanted them to see my team and me as experts in education, so that our legislators don't legislate by anecdote, which they often do, and really wanted to make changes on behalf of students. Sometimes we were successful and sometimes we weren't. The federal government, I relied on the federal government to make sure that we were following just the enormous amount of rules around IDEA and the entitlements, and our accountability model, but we also had a state accountability model that I paid much more attention to. And so I would say that I saw the federal government as more of a compliance measure than anything.
So given that, and given this idea that I think all three of you share, which is that the state education agency can materially impact the lives of kids by improving achievement and student well-being, I'm curious, can you just describe sort of like how in your seat you did that around one issue? And why don't we start with Catherine?
Yeah,
because I know
I'm
you have a
happy to
really...
start. Yeah, so the state superintendent in North Carolina is elected. I should share that context. There are 8 of us in the country that have partisan elections for this role. And I decided to run after spending my entire adult life in education. I decided to run because of the literacy issue. So about a third of kids in North Carolina are reading proficiently. So 67% are not reading proficiently when they start 9th grade. And when you disaggregate that data, it's even worse. So I was very familiar with the Soul to Story podcast and the Mississippi Miracle, and knew that my legislature was also kind of following these trends and looking at what Mississippi had done. And so we passed in April of 2021 bipartisan legislation that I would argue is the most comprehensive and best funded in the entire state, in the entire country, excuse me. And we mandated, which is a very unpopular word in both federal and state government, we mandated that all teachers participate in letters training, which is essentially a return to a phonics-based approach to early literacy instruction. And that was a very unpopular thing to do coming out of the pandemic. Asking teachers to undergo a 140-hour professional development was quite a heavy lift. But we did it anyway, because when it comes to our kids, we were and are committing education malpractice when it comes to literacy. So long story short, our K-3 foundational literacy data shows that our students are outperforming the rest of the nation in K-3, and our student groups have all seen double-digit gains in those K-3 foundational literacy pieces. So that's, thank you. I'll just close by saying that that was only able to happen because the governor's office, the Department of Public Instruction, the State Board of Education, the legislature were all rowing in the same direction, and that is a rare thing.
Yeah, I was trying to think of one thing. For context, in Washington, D.C., the state superintendent role is appointed, and so you serve directly at the pleasure of the executive. And similarly, I joined in the middle of the pandemic. We had just reopened our system. And I think our biggest bet is what has paid off now. We made a $40 million investment in high impact tutoring that was led through the state education agency. And that's significant Because often when you hear about recovery dollars, you will know that 90% of those dollars went directly into districts. This was separate, set-aside recovery dollars that the executive put into education, a seismic bet at a critical moment. And all of those resources were stewarded into our systems through the state education agency, targeting 10% of our at-risk students, designing school days, putting in interventions, really rethinking the way that high-impact tutoring could be done across a system. And I would say briefly, I mean, that is the reason why DC outperformed many other jurisdictions on the NAEP assessment. It's directly connected to that level of an investment. And I would say I could list many of the things: changing the graduation profile for students, changing social studies standards, lots of things happening behind the scenes, including an investment in the science of reading. But when you say, like, what's that thing you know you stewarded, our investment in high impact tutoring really transformed the way we talk about tutoring in the district. There's so many interventions that are framed for children as like negative things. And tutoring is something that even if you think through your own education career, if you had access, you would have access to a tutor. And in Washington, D.C., we worked very, very hard to ensure that students had access to a research-proven intervention that would dramatically accelerate their education. So I would leave it there.
Let me make one editorial comment first, which is I think we can sort of wax eloquently about states, but I'll put on the table. Many, many states don't have a plan, and their leaders are not actually vigorously pursuing vision that is student-centered or is anything more than kind of generally directed at students. It's, you know, the precision that you're hearing here with actually having a belief system, working it through the legislative and regulatory channels, and seeing it through to the ground. That's actually, I'd say, the exception rather than the rule. So I don't want the impression to be that states are fulfilling their jobs writ large. I think I would say my colleagues here are more the exception than the rule. But that being said, the issue that I think would be kind of interesting to pull out is about early childhood education.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because, in a way, Washington at its worst, and this is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, but Washington at its worst, I think, is kind of demonstrated in the early childhood system. You have Head Start, which is essentially a child care program and a nutrition program. It's managed out of our Department of Agriculture. You have a child care services that are managed out of a different human services agency. And then you have the education system where Title I and IDEA, those fund kids who are 3 and 4 and 5 years old as well. So you have Washington starts sending its money through the states, but essentially saying you have to run 3 separate systems. And so what do you end up with?
Yep.
Different standards of quality, different standards of access, different standards of teacher pay and teacher certification, and it's a complete mess, as anyone knows who has children in it, who has friends' children in it, who is educated in it, who works with the early childhood system. It's not a system. It's a system that's not a system. You know, our state, as you know well, Kunjan, wouldn't accept that. We decided to create at what we call the parish, or what Catherine would call the county level, coherent systems of early childhood education that enrolled kids in Head Start, child care, and pre-kindergarten programs through one enrollment system, that used the class system by the company Teachstone. By the way, big shout out to Teachstone. That's an extraordinary company. That used that system to measure quality on one standard, that created one minimum level of certification, that tried to create common levels of funding by using the state's funding power to assure that all of those seats are subsidized at relatively equivalent levels, and actually over time created a system that you could actually have some hope of improving at scale, and where you could reasonably guarantee a mom or dad or aunt or uncle of a 2, 3, or 4-year-old, you're going to get a seat because we actually have some semblance of systemic authority over this system. I highlight this just to say there was no huge piece of legislation, no mammoth, political knockdown, drag 'em out about this. And there really wasn't a lot of contribution from Washington other than occasional advice and guidance, as Christina said. It demonstrates that the states have the ability, they have the tools to do things at scale. They have the ability to moderate between resources and regulations from Washington and the real needs of people and communities, but it has to be done with a long-term view. It has to be done with a plan, and it has to be done with willing to get in the mix on the politics and make hard decisions.
So I want to pull out a couple of things that you all said, and I agree with John. You know, when you look at the NAEP results, they're dismal. Our kids need the system to do better by them, and there are a few bright spots in the NAEP data. Some of those are represented here on this state, but there really is an emerging sort of trend among some southern states. Tim Daly and a few others have termed this the Southern Surge. And similarly, there's a red-blue dynamic that's emerging. Red states are improving and some blue states are declining. In fact, many are. And I'm curious from your perspective, when you think about this from your state role, why is that happening?
Well, you know, my background has been to work. I worked in blue cities. I was in the Bloomberg administration in New York City with my dear colleague here. And I grew up in Washington, D.C. I moved to Louisiana. And I think fair to say, I don't see everything that is in the Republican agenda today on education as a positive. At the same time, I do think you have to look at the data and ask yourself, what is it about states in the Northeast and in the North Midwest, and to some degree in the West, that show that there is a kind of geographic trend, at least it's a correlation, to the downward trend that we're seeing. And I think there's a lot there, but I think it's worth being honest about. And I don't know enough to say that it's I know Tom Kane is somewhere in the audience, Christina. I don't
Hello,
Tom, where, you know, and any other economist would probably have my head with this, but I don't think it's anything more, at least, than correlation. But I do think it's worth noting, different states have different tools. And, you know, when you look at these three states, DC being a special kind of territory, and then North Carolina and Louisiana, it is a different thing from running the state system in New Jersey, or running the state system in New York, or I saw some of my friends, Jennifer, from Illinois. You know, these are places where there are districts that have one school in them. There are districts that have, you know, they're at the township or the village level. There are K-8 districts and high school districts, and, you know, these states have been carved up into a million different pieces. In Louisiana, we have 69 local education authorities, and we have some small ones in rural communities, but 69 is a manageable group, and there is a tradition, when you have that kind of structure in our state, that the state voice matters, that there's a shared conversation. And so when you look at the improvements that are happening in DC and Mississippi and Louisiana, when you see the work that Catherine initiated with that state leadership role in North Carolina, I do think you have to ask, you know, is there something to the governance model that, if it doesn't make progress a guarantee, because I don't think we should say anything to say the southern states are getting it right. They have a very, very long way to go, and they are characterized by generations of bigotry and bias and prejudice. But I do think you have to ask, do the states in the Northeast and the Midwest have the same tools to reverse this tide that states in the South do? And I think, by and large, because of purely structural reasons, maybe some political tradition reasons, the answer is no, they don't. And that worries me. That worries me when you're talking about the state commissioner in New Jersey, whatever your view, blue or red politics, needing to manage his or her way through literally 600 district relationships. The state role is different. I think that's unquestionable.
Yeah, thank you. I have been running around saying to anyone who will listen to me that right now we have a dynamic where education is such a behemoth of a thing, of an issue, that when it comes to the politics of education, the left and the right are just, it's easier for them to go in their separate corners and be with their tribes. And the left is saying, if we just have more money, we could fix X, Y, and Z. And the right is, in general, saying school choice will fix everything. And neither side is right. School choice is a great thing. More money is needed in some places, but neither one of those things is going to improve outcomes for all kids. And so I say that, but at the same time, I do believe that there are some policy differences in red and blue states that are impacting what's happening. And one of them is that red states are doubling down on accountability while blue states are pulling back from accountability in general. Also, what we did in North Carolina, and I work with a lot of states and have worked with a lot of states, and my national context shows me that there are many states that will not mandate that teachers do things differently because they're afraid of the teachers' unions. And that's just the simple truth. That doesn't make teachers' unions bad. They are serve a purpose for the adults who are their members. But I have worked as a turnaround coach in some of the poorest districts in our state. And when teachers who are teach children who are in that 6% that Trinace mentioned, refusing to accept the professional development that is offered to them, I think that's a problem.
I have just the range of thoughts. One, I would start with my current day job. So if you go visit educationrecoveryscorecard.org, you can see our recent release of a little over 8,000 school districts in the country, of which only 100 or so school districts have recovered to their pre-pandemic state, right? So I want to drill in on some of what we've shared, and I'd say roughly it's three things. And John, I wonder if you agree with this. In the states that one would say are bright spots, there's a through line of visionary leadership and like a doubling down in education across the change in this seat. So you consistently saw visionary leadership, at least in DC, that is true. Before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and today, the mayor of Washington, DC has been very clear about targeted investments in early childhood education, K-12 education, and pushing to be clear about what students do on the other side of getting their high school diploma. So there's something there that we should name around strategic planning, visionary leadership, and a statewide or district-wide focus on education. I would say, as someone who's only lived, worked, and operated in quote-unquote blue states, there is some resting on laurels that's happening, particularly in the state that I'm a board member of, which is Massachusetts. There's something to say you're number one, except you're not number one for everyone.
Exactly.
And so there's some come to Jesus moments that need to happen when, yes, you are number one, except when you look at subgroup data, it is crystal clear that as you have a change in demographics, a change in who is leading and learning in those systems, there's a reckoning that's gonna have to take place, which southern states are slowly, but in ways that cause us to engage in this conversation, that number one spot might not be true for long. And then I think it is directly connected to what is happening in the classroom. Some of us are old enough to have gone to NewSchools 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where we would never have had a panel called Can We Save Public Education? Because we were in this room saving public education, opening schools. I've opened more charter schools in this country than most, right? Trying new school models, pushing back like hell. In DC, we still have performance-based pay. Control how you feel about it. But we were, I'm not a superintendent anymore. I don't take violence. I don't take critiques well. But the truth is, not just the four of us, but everybody in this room knew what it took to get measurable growth in our systems across this country. And we saw it, and then there was a moment in time where we stopped doing those things because they are uncomfortable, because they are hard, because you will not get reelected, because people will write bad things about you in the newspaper, and we find ourselves literally sitting in the worst group project ever. Like what we are sitting in right now, worst group project ever. But the path through it, I would argue, are many of the things that we did in New York City, that took place in Newark, New Jersey, that occurred and still occurs in Washington, D.C. And the question I think before us is, are we willing to hold hands and do it again?
Yeah, I mean, let me just piggyback on that. I think you look at DC, what has happened in DC over now 2 decades? Certainly there's plenty of lumps and so on, as there is in any change of that magnitude, but the results for kids in a city that is overwhelmingly low-income kids of color in the public system. I grew up in that city. It's a changed place, and not just because of gentrification, but because young men and women of color are reading and doing math and completing high school and going to college at levels wouldn't have been contemplated when I was growing up there. And it is what you said. I mean, it is decade after decade, year after year. I mean, you can name the people, and it's not, just Michelle Rhee and Kai Henderson. It is a generation of leaders, culminating really and continuing beyond you, Christina, but culminating with you in Washington. And it's about them, the district and the state, which are two separate entities there, rowing in the same direction. And I think what I'm positing in a way and taking from this conversation is, I think there were elements of that in Louisiana that I'm very proud of our work there, which is from Democrat governors. Our most recent was a Democrat. His predecessor was a Republican. The current was a Republican. State board members, legislators, state superintendents over decades, even before Katrina, laying groundwork and generally rowing in the same direction as state leaders and at the district level. And I think that is more feasible when, whether you're blue or red, there is an understanding that there's a mission there, that there's a vigor that is expected from the people at the top of the system. That has to exist. And secondly, frankly, I just think it's a lot easier when there's not, 1,000 local education agencies to manage in the way that there is in New York. And each one of those school boards has its own politics, has its own collective bargaining agreement in those states. And there's just complexity in those systems. And I do think we need to wrestle with the fact, I say this as somebody who's from that part of the country, that in the East Coast, to some extent here in California, certainly in the Northeast and the North Midwest, it is hard to get the types of changes that we're talking about done. And I don't think it's because Democratic politics are averse to it. I think it's because structurally, those systems exist in a way where change is just a little bit harder. The state-district relationship is a different one. The states tend to be a little bit more passive than the type of very vigorous, active work that you're talking about here today. And I think, I'm not saying it's the thing that has caused the NAEP results, but I think as we think about how to dig ourselves out of it, it's something to address.
And, if we take this conversation to the current moment, then we are seeing executive orders that are directing states to do all kinds of things. We're seeing a rescission of grant money. We're seeing sort of directives that are confusing to state agencies. And what you all are describing in terms of your leadership is already rare. And now we see again that we are dealing with a new set of headwinds. So I'm curious from you, what is it that you think state chiefs right now should be taking advantage of, and what is it that you are most worried about given the federal climate? Christina, why don't we start with you?
Oh, I don't want to start first. Gosh, such a hard question. So I would say on the front end, my colleagues are being very bold. I will attempt to be as well. The states are not ready for the things that they even may say themselves they want to do. There's so much that could already exist through state education agencies. And so there will have to be, I'm talking particularly to the funders in the room, deep investments in state education agency capacity. That's not just to research centers to help that work, but I think there is a significant amount of work that will have to be done for the type of bold, innovative, strategic planning, particularly if you're going to stay true to protecting accountability and assessment. Because Catherine noted that there's federal compliance, but she was laser-like focused on her state system. But what if there are dramatic improvements that have to be made at the state level? Everything from standards to the way you collect attendance, all of that work will have to be designed and built out. And I think for me, what worries me the most is we already know that zip code in this country predicates your life outcomes. We know that. If we make a massive shift and we don't have the right leadership in the governor's house, at the head of an SEA, we will have wider gaps than I think any of us are ready to unpack. And that is because for most of us, like Kunjan, I wasn't born, I'd just been born when the Department of Education came to exist. And so the rhetoric of, well, we can just do away with that, that is deeply concerning for me as a Black woman. Because in my mind, whether believed or imagined, there was this thing that was protecting what was happening state to state. That a child in Alabama could have access to an education that remotely looked like what a child in New York would have access to. Those types of real things concern me. And I think inside the SEA level, we talk quickly about building out your leadership team and staffing up your data and research team and making sure that all of this work that happens behind the scenes is happening at a high level and at high quality. And I'm just not sure all states are ready to meet that moment if there truly is no federal government doing the role of compliance. Because we talk about compliance as a bad thing, but as I've said to them, even I in DC would say, nope, can't have a snow day because the federal government counts instructional hours and we have to meet our instructional hours. That's just on a snow day. What happens when it's literally on your state to make sure there's high quality instructional materials, to make sure that there's a high quality assessment, that subgroup data is collected and reported in a transparent fashion, because there's no federal requirement for that to be done? How many children get lost as data points? Then they can't be served because they can't be seen because no one's talking about them. Those are the things that keep me up, literally keep me up at night, and is the focus of our work at CEPR as we're trying to bring states together to lead and learn, and it's not a blue-red situation right now.
Yeah, my concern is just stasis in our country. I think that, I grew up professionally, I know a number of us did, in a time when it was expected that the president have a forward-looking view on the future of the quality of schooling in America. The first President Bush really, I think, was the catalyst for that. President Clinton gets, I think, underestimated as an education president. President Bush, the second, obviously had a real vision with No Child Left Behind, and President Obama, especially in his first term, was a very vigorous education president. It was all about their relationship with the states. They wanted the juice that they could squeeze out of the system, they got from the states. And so they were constantly trying to up the bar, and the states were trying to catch up to it. And I think over the last 10 to 15 years, there's essentially been no upping of the bar. And at the same time, there's been no states saying, hey, President, Mr. President, Ms. President, you must push on the bar. And I think that is a fundamental problem right now. And so that ultimately is my concern, is that we have to get back to a place where the federal government sees it, federal officials see it in their political interest to say education is one of my leading things, and not just tearing the house down, but actually making it better. And states are going to have to push. I agree with Christina. If I were to think about how to contribute capacity, to contribute resources, I would think about what states are going to lead as examples that help the rest of the country in a way that the federal government can ultimately emulate and embody and build into a better version of the Department of Education and No Child Left Behind in the future.
The most famous education governor in North Carolina, of course, is Governor Jim Hunt, who did a lot of firsts, but is especially known for early childhood education. And he always said, education cannot just be one more thing that we do. But it has become just one more thing that we do. And what worries me is that, I think it's been said already, what John describes as the structural challenges of our states. And when you combine that with the K-12 governance challenges that many states have, where you're talking about an elected state superintendent with a board that's appointed by the governor, and yet the legislature holds the purse strings, and there's any variation of that kind of governance structure makes it across all states, makes it very difficult to row in the same direction on anything. And so in using Christina's example of who's going to support marginalized students who are not performing academically if there's no federal accountability model and it's just your state accountability model. We know from research that states are not investing in supports for low-performing schools. States are relying on those federal investments to do that. So I just think that there's a host of challenges, including the fact that if we're honest, most of the folks who work at the departments of public instruction or the SEAs, whatever you want to call it, they're such lovely, well-intentioned folks, but they've often been there for 20 years and have not been in a school. It's not their job to be in schools. And so I've had recent conversations with state leaders that certainly leave me a little worried about the capacity for states to take on various roles in the absence of a robust federal presence.
I'm going to take a couple of audience questions that have come in. So one, we're losing ground on why public schools matter to kids, communities in our country. How can states take the lead in advancing an affirmative, inspiring purpose for public school?
How can states take the lead in
advancing an affirmative and inspiring purpose for public schools?
Well, I think part of the Republicans' drive toward school choice and choice generally in the wake of the pandemic is realizing that that's a fast way to deliver real value to real people. And a harder thing to do is to say, through the system that pre-exists, we're going to find ways of delivering value too, but that's kind of the job. And that's the governor's job. That's the state education chief's job. The state should be saying, this is what we can commit to doing for your child, and then be able to show quantitative evidence that it's done that. And if you're not doing the job in that way, what the hell are you doing the job for?
Yeah.
But the truth of it is most states are more passive regulators than they are guarantors of a specific outcome for kids.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the day of the education governor has to return. I think of Janice's statement around just how much parents don't know about the education of their own child. I would argue there has to be a transparency campaign that parents understand everything from why it matters to come to school every day to your child is not reading at grade level. That would change. Like if we had a massive group of parents that deeply understood, and I don't just mean poor parents or black and brown parents, even some of the most privileged families in this country have no idea that their child cannot read at grade level. And I think that level of transparency would shift the narrative that would force elected officials to understand that that has to be as much a part of their campaign platform, promise, et cetera, as workforce development, as jobs, as improving infrastructure. We lost that. We lost holding elected officials accountable for having a strong education agenda and holding them to that agenda.
Yep.
Another audience question. In the face of deep uncertainty around federal funding, how can states support districts in strategic budget shifts without compromising on student outcomes?
Well, states.
I have an answer, I just didn't want to go first.
I mean, I think, states, whether it's a charter school, a non-public school, or a traditional public school, states should not be a source of incoherence. And I would say, to Catherine's point about well-intended people who've been working in the bureaucracy for 30 years, if we're being honest, at an operational level, most states' agencies are incredibly incoherent, fractured themselves, and terrible at communicating. Mm-hmm. That's just a management challenge. And it can't solve all the federal funding woes, but what it can do is create a seamless picture. I mean, you led Louisiana toward having, rather than 13 different federal grant cycles, one federal grant cycle. Rather than 13 different federal grant applications out of 13 different offices, one federal grant application out of one office. And
it was 30, by the way.
30.
30.
30. I wish you would have told me 10 years ago. Anyways, that's the kind of reform that understands the perspective of school leaders and district leaders and tries to simplify their world. The states can do that, but they need to take their operations seriously.
And I would add to that this absence of dollars from the federal government through the research grants, not just, we don't know if there's going to be a loss of entitlement dollars. That has to be approved by Congress. But the research dollars that are certainly going to be lost, that's an opportunity for funders, who some of you are in this room, to start calling the shots and to really stand up for what your organization believes is what needs to happen in order to move the needle for kids. I think it's an exciting time to be in your shoes.
Yes, and I think as funders think about their investments, this alignment between research and practice should never be stronger. So if you are making investments in states that don't want to discuss accountability or assessments and work with researchers, not just because I represent one, in ensuring that there is value add for the investment, you should question the investment. I would say on the side of the state education agency, this is time for leaders to understand the dollars and cents of their budgets. There is a lot of money inside state education agencies that can be repurposed, reprogrammed, aligned in different ways to make sure that the main thing becomes the main thing. And it's gonna require a different type of leader who can have strategic budgetary abandonment conversations. We've been doing this thing for 10 years. It is not moving the needle for anyone. Why are we doing it? Oh, lovely vendor, do you have any evidence that what you are doing inside our system is meeting the needs of the children in our system? We're not doing it. So it's gonna make parts of the role widely unpopular, but that's you never waste a crisis. It's gonna force a lot of states to get very clear very quickly. And I would just underscore what Catherine said. What is happening in the research community right now is we will pay for this in ways that I don't even think we have yet to begin to understand. The through line between what happens in higher education research and what happens over time in the classroom has contributed to the growth and progress that we sit and talk about today. And funders need to know and understand that it's their role to step up in this moment to support the work that matters.
One example of that I think is happening right now in this state is your legislature, Californians, is finally getting around to adopting and emulating Catherine and the legislature in North Carolina's work around a bill around the science of reading and high quality literacy instruction. It's about time. And the funders would be missing an opportunity not to recognize some of the challenges that the state agency, the county offices, and the districts are going to have in that implementation. Yep. The governor I know is including, $453 or some $1 million in the budget for that. That's great news. But funders can really strategically embed research and other supports for that effort. It's an incredible opportunity if we make the most of it.
We have 10 seconds. And I'm going to ask each panelist to answer very briefly, what does courageous state leadership look like right now? In one sentence or two.
Well, I've lived through this the last several months, so I will say that courageous leadership is not being afraid to put students first, even if it's going to cost you your job.
Yeah, and honestly, as someone who led in DC, particularly as a Black woman, courageous leadership means not taking the bait. They want you to walk around angry all the time. They want you to write reckless posts on Instagram or sit and, pen things that don't serve you a purpose. Courageous leadership is, what is the mission in service of the children that I am responsible for? And every single day, how do I lead through that? And if I never say the word diversity, equity, inclusion again, that does not change the work in front of us. And I have watched so many people fall into the trap of what I would call the noise instead of being courageous to lead. And that is exceptionally hard right now. And so you have to be courageous to stand in front of people and make the main thing be the main thing. The main thing is come to school every single day. The main thing is high quality instructional materials. The main thing is ensuring that teachers are trained and ready to stand before our children. And I'm not gonna courageous leadership would not be letting people take you off of that focus to be distracted by things that could remove you from the table, which is their intent in the first place.
Very hard to follow those two responses, but I'll just say this. I think the tragedy of our times is the electoral map that shows that my state is a big sea of red, except my city, New Orleans, which is a strong dot of blue. That's a tragedy. There's no purple in my state. And the courageous leadership, I think, for state leaders today is to have a real vision down to the teacher and kid level, and then walk into rooms that aren't your party affiliation.
Right.
Sell that vision hard to the people, because your vision gets better and our society gets better when we are forced to confront people with different perspectives than our own. That's the job of political leaders. But today, cowardice looks like just hanging out with friends who look like you and think like you, and we've got to change that.
Yeah.
There is a red light blinking at me to say that we need to wrap. So on that note, we are going to wrap. I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. I want to thank our panelists for your insights. And I hope you leave this conversation understanding that systems matter to kids. And in this moment today in this country, we need our systems to step up for children and do better to serve them to be literate, numerate, and be able to live a choice-filled life. And so I thank this group for the work you do to make that true every day, and I thank all of you for the work you do to make that true every day. Thank you so much for being here.